Okay, let's jump into it. Always hear these questions of what percent of Brazil is black? Are there more black people in Brazil over the US? And the last one is outside of Africa, Brazil has the most Africans over the US. Now, after visiting Brazil many times, many years, and visiting many cities in Brazil, and just by me being black American and knowing my country, my conclusion is yes. Outside of Africa, Brazil had the most Africans, and that was just due to the Portuguese continuing slavery after the U.S. stopped. Now, I think Brazil abolished slavery in 1888, while the U.S. stopped in around 1865. So that means Brazil had an advantage of 23 years of bringing Africans to Brazil, making the population more black than white over the U.S. Now, here comes the twist. After slavery came to an end in Brazil, the Portuguese had to, how can I say, stimulate, they had to increase their population. And by doing this, specifically, they gave Germans and Italians free land if they came to Brazil. And this lasted for about, guess what, 40 years. 40 years. So besides the Portuguese that was already there, now Germans and Italians, now you had a population more white than black. And if you visited Brazil before, you would notice that the big migration of Germans is mainly in the southern part of Brazil. And also you would notice that the Italian migration was mainly in the state of Sao Paulo. So, in conclusion, I would say currently, no. No. Brazil does not have more blacks or Africans than the US. Not at all. Because what people tend to forget is that the US has more migration currently of Africans coming to the US over Brazil. Africans are not migrating in high amount of numbers to Brazil. They're migrating to places where opportunities are more valuable than their home country and where they see themselves having a future because they see people that look like them. And that is mainly in Europe, mainly in the UK, and also in North America, mainly to the US. And if they can't get into the US, their second best option is Canada. Brazil is not on that list. So currently, the US does have more blacks and Africans over Brazil. Also, you got to take into account that every day there's somebody in the US that has went to Africa, married an African, and they bring them back to the US. This is not happening in high amount of numbers in Brazil. You're not seeing lots of Brazilians going to Africa, marrying Africans, and bringing them back to Brazil. It's the other way around. So take that into note also. So Brazil does not have more blacks or Africans than the US. At a time, yes, they did, but currently, no, they do not. In my previous video, I did give a hint on the next place I would visit, and I did say that this was the second place I visited after Rio, which was my first city I ever visited. Rio was my first city, and after Rio, I decided to come to Salvador, Bahia to check it out because I did hear that outside of Africa, Brazil had the most Africans. And also I heard that slavery started in Salvador, Bahia. So this is what grew my interest to visit this city. And after visiting Rio for many years, I did see black people in Rio. But back then, when I first visited in 2008, I still had in mind that the U.S. had more. I seen more black people in different states in the U.S. than I did in Rio. So when I came to what you're saying now is Salvador Bahia, I had expected to see more black people than I saw in Rio, and I did. Salvador Bahia is where slavery started in Brazil, and when I first visited, I saw way more black people in Salvador Bahia than I did in Rio. But also, I've seen more black people in Atlanta, Georgia than I have in Salvador Bahia. So, Salvador Bahia is probably the blackest city in the country of Brazil, no doubt. Yes, it is. But I've seen other cities in the U.S. that has more black people than Salvador Bahia, especially more black people that's doing more well off. That's the big difference. When you go to places like Atlanta and other black cities in the U.S., you see black movie companies. You see a lot of black business. You see a lot of black people doing well off, driving Lamborghinis and all other kind of things that you do not see in Salvador Bahia. And it is because of economics, but also it's because of racism also. A lot of people complain about racism in the US, but until you visit other countries, and we're talking about Brazil, then you will really see racism. So in a later video, I will continue to talk about violence because I haven't got to that topic yet, and I will also talk about racism in Brazil. But we're still talking about this thing of Brazil has more Africans than the US, which is, at one point, I believed it for like many, many years, almost a decade, until I started just opening my eyes and just using my common sense and doing a little research. And I found out that, at a point in time, yes, it was true, but currently it is not. It's very obvious, and you just got to use your common sense of migration. So if you made it this far in the video, hopefully you will do your own outside research and just use your common sense, and you will come to the conclusion like I did that no, Brazil does not have more Africans or blacks outside of Africa over the US. At a point in time, like I mentioned, they did. When the US and other European countries stopped slavery, you had this one country, Brazil, that continued for 23 years. So they had a 23-year advantage of increasing their black population. But also you have to keep in mind that currently there are not Africans migrating to Brazil. Currently there's not high amounts of Brazilians going to Africa, marrying Africans, bringing them back to Brazil. But this is still happening to this day in the US. So our number is continuing increasing, while Brazil, their number is still at a standstill. Their white population is more than their black population currently. Also, I hear that most black Brazilians live in favelas, and that is a true and false statement. What makes a statement false is that if you visited outside of tourist areas in Brazil and you visited favelas, you will notice that in those favelas, not only do you see black Brazilians, but also you see white Brazilians as well. And that's just due to, oh man, I don't know where to start, numerous things that happened in Brazil a long time ago. One of them that I mentioned is that the promise that the Portuguese made to the Italians and Germans, yes, some of them did get free land, and you had a lot of them that did not. So what they did do is they migrated to other parts of Brazil. For example, they migrated to Rio. They migrated to Salvador. They migrated to other parts of Brazil. And you had some that had no option but to make their own home in a favela. And a favela is just basically a home built from raw materials. So that raw material could be wood, metal, it could be anything you can think of to make housing. And the first time visiting Brazil, this is something you would notice. There's favela tours, which I would recommend you to go on to see how people live, because that's what you want to see when you go to other countries. You want to see how people live, see what people eat, see how people work. These are the things so you can make a comparison from that country to your own country. So hopefully you appreciate where you come from in your own country, because that's what happened to me when I came to Brazil for the first time. I appreciated the U.S. because I could see myself. Well, this could be me. I could have been living in Brazil, and not to say that Brazil is a bad place, but the economics of Brazil isn't all that great. Also, I hear is that Brazil has a more mixed society over the U.S., and that's not true. Let's just use our common sense. Globally, you can name any country, and most likely a person from that country lives in the U.S. Not only lives in the U.S., but most likely they have a community based in a certain city in the U.S., unlike Brazil. And do you not think that Chinese American, Japanese American, Ethiopians, people from Ghana do not interracial marriage? Of course they do. And the end product is a interracial kid. Therefore, yes, the U.S. does have a more mixed society over Brazil because of that. We have people globally from everywhere. Brazil does not. Also, you would think since Brazil have such a high black population that they would have had many black presidents. But the case is they have not. They have not had any. But this is more of racism in Brazil that, like I said, I would touch on later in a separate video at some point. I think what happened was people saw that Brazil had the longest slavery period, and they just equated that to Brazil having the most Africans, the most black people, which was true. But what they forgot to think about is migration and immigrants. The U.S. is the leader of having lots of immigrants, lots of migration versus or over Brazil. And also what people forget to think about is in the U.S. we have something that's called sister cities. For example, like the sister city of Ethiopia or Addis Ababa is Washington, D.C. The sister city of Somalia basically is Minneapolis. The sister city of Cape Verde is in the state of Massachusetts. So we have large communities of these people from Africa in the U.S. So not only is the U.S. more diverse and we have more Africans from different African countries over Brazil, but also we have more of a mixed society over Brazil, because you have to think that these people do interracially marry in the U.S. It happens all the time. Something you would notice once you visit Salvador, Bahia is some, not all, but some black Brazilians are more in tune to their African side, to their African culture, more than any other black Brazilians that live in any other city in Brazil. And that is because of that 23-year advantage that the Portuguese had of bringing Africans from specific countries that the Portuguese colonized to Salvador, Bahia. They were able to communicate and keep their culture, their religion intact, unlike the British. The British just got table scraps of Africans, brought them to the U.S., and that is the reason that Brazil had more slave rebellions than the U.S., because the black Brazilians in Brazil were able to communicate because they came from certain countries and they spoke the same language. Unlike the Africans in the U.S. that were brought, they were brought from all over, so they couldn't communicate because they had different languages from different tribes, so it was just totally opposite. And when I mentioned that the British brought table scraps of Africans to the U.S., I meant that basically the British did not bring large amount of Africans as the Portuguese did. You know, the Portuguese brought more Africans because slavery lasted longer in Brazil. Also, I did say that specifically in Salvador Bahia, you have more, or you have some, not all, black Brazilians that are more in tune to their African side, their African religion, than any other city in Brazil. And that is a true statement. But also, what is kind of interesting is that the people that I've met in Salvador Bahia, when I ask them, do you actually know what country in Africa your family is from or your ancestors are from, they have no idea. I have not met anyone up until this date that know exactly where in Africa their family heritage come from, and they do not know any African language. So where and how did the Portuguese bring all these Africans to Salvador Bahia, their final destination in Brazil? Well, strategically, the Portuguese colonized the country right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, in which they named Cape Verde. And Cape Verde was basically like a resting point slash monitor post to see what other European countries were bringing West African slaves to the Americas. And sometimes what the Portuguese did is they would ambush these ships carrying slaves from Britain and other countries, take those slaves, and they would ship them back to mainland Africa, to the countries that the Portuguese colonized, while some stayed on the island of Cape Verde, while others, not a lot, went to Portugal, because at the time only the most prestigious people in Portugal had slaves. If you don't know, not a lot of slaves went to Europe at all. The whole point was to keep the slaves in the countries that were colonized and not to bring them to Europe. But you had some prestige people in Portugal that had slaves, and the majority, the bulk of these slaves went to what you're seeing now is Salvador Bahia. When you travel, you start to learn more. When I first came to Salvador Bahia, something also interesting that happened to me was the first person I met did not claim black Brazilian or white Brazilian. She claimed Indian. And it was strange because she was in Salvador Bahia. And I was wondering how she got there. She got there because of her mom. Her mom is from Manaus, and they came to Salvador Bahia because of work. So by them being Indian or indigenous, that means that they were there before the Portuguese even came. So this just sparked my interest in indigenous people of the Americas, not just South America. And if you just keep reading, you keep getting deeper and deeper, you start learning about this thing called the Bering Strait. And basically this was a period before slavery, a time when all continents was connected, which allowed people the opportunity to walk to other continents, to other countries. And we know this is true because this explains why there's black people in Australia and they call them Aboriginal. This is why there's black people in the island of Fiji. It explains why there's a small community of black people in South India. So we know the Bering Strait had to be true because how did they get there? I'm going to end the video by saying if you have a chance to visit Brazil, come check out Salvador Bahia. Mainly because Salvador Bahia is way different than any other city you'll visit in Brazil. Mainly because Salvador Bahia has the highest population of black Brazilians in Brazil. Notice I said in Brazil, not the US. And you need to come and check it out for yourself. And also, always, if you have a lot of time on your vacation, always check out an extra city, because the city that you intended to visit, you may not like it as the second city you have visited. So it gives you more of an opportunity to see transitions, different people, And I always encourage that. And until next time, make sure you subscribe to this channel, like the video, and make a comment if you have any. I'm out.